The harsh morning sunlight filtering through the train windows awakened Jane Beaumont from a fitful sleep, her body aching from the 3-day journey from Boston to Arizona Territory. It was April 1882, and as the train whistled its approach to Nogales, Jane clutched the wrinkled photograph of Vincent Walsh, her soon-to-be husband, whom she had never met in person. The correspondence that had brought her west promised a new life, far from the crowded Boston streets where opportunities for a 23-year-old seamstress had grown scarce after her parents' passing. Jane smoothed her travel-worn navy blue dress, pinched her cheeks for color, and touched the simple gold locket around her neck, the last gift from her mother. The train lurched to a stop, releasing a cloud of steam that momentarily obscured the small Nogales station platform through the window. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her 2 modest valises, one containing clothing, the other her prized sewing supplies. "Nogales, last stop before the border," the conductor called, swinging through the passenger car. Jane's palms dampened with sweat as she made her way down the narrow aisle. What if Vincent wasn't there? What if he took one look at her and changed his mind? His letters had described a successful cattle ranch 10 miles outside of town, a comfortable home awaiting a wife's touch, and a respectable man of 30 years seeking a partner in life. The photograph showed a handsome man with a strong jaw and serious eyes. The heat hit her like a physical force as she stepped onto the platform. Nogales, Arizona Territory, looked nothing like the Boston she'd left behind. Dust swirled across the unpaved Main Street, and the buildings, a mixture of adobe and wooden structures, seemed temporary compared to the solid brick of her former home. "Miss Beaumont," the voice came from her left, and Jane turned to see a tall man removing his hat. She recognized him immediately from the photograph, though the real Vincent Walsh appeared harder, somehow, his jaw tighter, his eyes colder. "Mr. Walsh," she replied, forcing a smile. "You're prettier than your picture," he said, not returning her smile. His gaze traveled up and down her figure in a way that made her skin prickle despite the heat. "Thank you for meeting me," Jane said, extending her gloved hand. Instead of shaking it, Vincent took her valises. "The wagon's this way. I've got supplies to pick up, so we'll be in town a while before heading to the ranch." As Jane followed him through the dusty street, disappointment settled in her stomach. There had been no warmth in his greeting, no pleasure in his eyes at finally meeting his bride-to-be. She reminded herself that many men of the frontier weren't given to displays of emotion. Perhaps once they were alone, once they had time to become acquainted, the man whose thoughtful letters had won her heart would emerge. The town of Nogales bustled with activity: cowboys leading horses, Mexican vendors selling food from carts, women gossiping outside the general store. Jane noticed the curious glances directed her way, marking her as a newcomer, an Easterner whose clothing and bearing set her apart. "Wait in the wagon," Vincent instructed after helping her onto the wooden seat. "I'll be in the general store. Don't wander off." Jane nodded, folding her hands in her lap as Vincent strode away. The commanding tone of his voice surprised her, but she reasoned that he was likely anxious to complete his errands and show her to her new home. She watched the activity around her with interest, taking in the sights and sounds of the frontier town that was now her home. A cowboy leading a magnificent chestnut horse passed by the wagon, tipping his hat when he caught her eye. He was younger than Vincent, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and kind brown eyes. Jane smiled politely in return, then quickly looked away, not wanting to appear forward. When Vincent returned nearly an hour later, his arms laden with supplies, his face was flushed and his movements jerky. The smell of whiskey reached Jane as he loaded the wagon, and her stomach tightened with unease. "Had to wet my whistle," he explained, seeing her expression. "Long ride ahead." The journey to the ranch was silent and uncomfortable. Vincent made no attempt at conversation, and Jane's nervous questions about the property and the area were met with curt responses. When she mentioned her plans to establish a small garden, Vincent laughed harshly. "Garden's a waste of time. You'll have enough to do keeping the house." As they approached the ranch, Jane's heart sank further. The comfortable home Vincent had described in his letters was a crude, weather-beaten cabin with a sagging porch. The surrounding land appeared dry and neglected, with only a few scraggly cattle visible in the distance. A single, tired-looking ranch hand emerged from a smaller structure to take the horses. "Pete," Vincent called, "this here's the woman I wrote about." "Jane," Pete nodded, his eyes darting quickly to Jane before returning to the ground. "Madam," he mumbled. "Show her the house," Vincent ordered, handing the reins to Pete. "I need to check the south pasture." Without another word to Jane, Vincent strode away, leaving her standing in the dusty yard with her valises at her feet. Pete awkwardly gestured toward the cabin. "It ain't much, madam, but it's shelter," he said apologetically. Inside, the cabin consisted of 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace, rough wooden table and 2 chairs, and a small bedroom with an iron bedstead. Everything was coated with a fine layer of dust, and the smell of stale tobacco hung in the air. This was to be her home, Jane realized, fighting back tears of disappointment. Pete helped bring in her belongings, then retreated with a mumbled excuse about tending to the horses. Left alone, Jane removed her bonnet and gloves, then set about exploring her new home. The kitchen area consisted of a cast iron stove, a few chipped plates and cups in a cabinet, and a bucket for water. No gardens, no feminine touches, no signs that this place had been prepared for a bride. By the time Vincent returned at sundown, Jane had swept the floors, wiped down the surfaces, and prepared a simple meal from the provisions she found in the pantry. Her back ached, her throat was parched from the dust, but she was determined to make the best of her situation. "You need to fetch water from the well each morning," Vincent informed her as he wolfed down the beans and salt pork she'd prepared. "Pete usually brings in firewood. I expect breakfast at sunrise. I work from dawn till dusk." "I understand," Jane replied, picking at her own food. "I noticed the roof has a leak in the corner. Perhaps tomorrow I could." "Women don't fix roofs," Vincent interrupted. "I'll get to it when I have time." Jane bit her lip, surprised by his tone. "I only meant to mention it." "In your letters, you said you wanted a practical wife who could contribute to the running of the ranch." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "I wanted a wife who knows her place," he said coldly. "Your job is inside these walls, not telling me what needs fixing." The harshness of his words stunned Jane into silence. This was not the man whose letters had spoken of partnership and mutual respect. As the evening progressed, Vincent drank from a bottle he retrieved from beneath the bed, becoming increasingly irritable. When Jane accidentally broke a cup while washing the dishes, his reaction was immediate and terrifying. "Damned clumsy woman," he shouted, crossing the room in 2 strides. He grabbed her arm with bruising force, his face contorted with anger. "Those things cost money." "I'm sorry," Jane gasped, frightened by the transformation. "It slipped. I'll be more careful." Vincent released her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling against the table. "See that you are, and clean up that mess before you come to bed. I paid good money to bring you out here. Least you can do is earn your keep." That night, as Jane lay beside her snoring husband-to-be, tears slid silently down her cheeks. The marriage ceremony was scheduled for the following week when the circuit preacher came through town. Until then, Vincent had insisted they would live as man and wife, an arrangement that had led to a painful, loveless encounter that left Jane feeling more like property than a future wife. Morning came too soon. Jane rose before dawn to fetch water and prepare breakfast as instructed. Her arm bore purple marks from Vincent's grip, and she winced as she pulled on her dress, careful to select one with long sleeves despite the heat. As she worked, she tried to convince herself that things would improve. Perhaps Vincent had been tired from the journey, anxious about her arrival. Perhaps once they were properly married, once she proved her worth as a wife, his behavior would change. But as days passed, Jane's hope diminished. Vincent's temper was unpredictable, erupting over minor issues, meals not prepared to his liking, questions about the ranch operations, or simply her presence when he returned home in a foul mood. The beautiful letters that had wooed her had clearly been written by someone else or crafted with deliberate deception. The real Vincent Walsh was a harsh, bitter man whose ranch was failing due to neglect, and whose treatment of his soon-to-be wife grew increasingly cruel. On the fourth day, Jane ventured to ask about visiting town to purchase thread for mending. "You think I'm made of money," Vincent snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "Use what you brought or do without. There's no reason for you to go to town." I only thought the back of his hand connected with her cheek before she could finish, sending her staggering backward. The shock of the blow momentarily robbed her of breath. "That's your problem," Vincent said, standing over her. "You think too much. Women aren't meant for thinking. They're meant for working and obeying." That night, Jane lay awake long after Vincent had fallen into a drunken sleep, planning her escape. The nearest town was 10 miles away, and she had no horse, no money beyond the few dollars sewn into the lining of her valise. Even if she could reach Nogales, where would she go? Who would help an unmarried woman alone on the frontier? The thought of returning to Boston in disgrace, of admitting her terrible mistake, seemed impossible. The following morning, Vincent announced he would be gone for 2 days to drive cattle to a neighboring ranch. "Don't get any ideas while I'm gone," he warned, his eyes cold. "Pete will be keeping an eye on things, and remember, there's nowhere to run out here. Desert would kill you before you made it 5 miles. Once Vincent had ridden away, Jane allowed herself to breathe. 2 days of relative freedom stretched before her 2 days to think, to plan, perhaps to find a solution to her desperate situation. She spent the morning cleaning the cabin thoroughly, then ventured outside to examine the property in daylight. The ranch was larger than she'd initially realized, with a small barn, corrals for horses, and a bunkhouse where Pete stayed. Beyond the immediate buildings, the land stretched toward distant mountains, beautiful in its wild harshness. To the west, perhaps half a mile away, Jane could see another ranch, a larger, well-maintained property with green pastures and substantial buildings. Pete emerged from the barn, nodding awkwardly to Jane. "Mr. Walsh get off all right, madam?" "Yes," Jane replied, gathering her courage. "Pete, may I ask you something?" The ranch hand shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "Who owns the property to the west?" "That'd be Valiant Westbrook's place," Pete answered. "Valley View Ranch. He's got the most prosperous spread in these parts." "Does he?" Jane hesitated. "Does he know Vincent well?" Pete's eyes darted away. "They ain't exactly friendly, madam." "Best not to mention Mr. Westbrook to your husband." Jane nodded, filing this information away. Later, as she hung laundry on the line behind the cabin, she noticed a rider approaching from the direction of the neighboring ranch. The tall figure on horseback guided his chestnut gelding toward the property line, then dismounted to repair a section of fence. With a start, Jane recognized the cowboy who had tipped his hat to her in town. He worked steadily, his movements efficient and practiced. Without fully understanding why, Jane found herself walking toward the property line, a dipper of water in hand as her excuse. The cowboy looked up as she approached, surprise registering on his face before he smiled and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, madam." "Good afternoon," Jane replied, suddenly nervous. "I thought you might be thirsty working in this heat." He accepted the dipper gratefully. "That's mighty kind of you, Valiant Westbrook," he introduced himself, extending a calloused hand. "Most folks call me Val." "Jane Beaumont," she replied, taking his hand briefly. I'm staying at the Walsh Ranch." Something flickered in Val's eyes, recognition, perhaps concern. "I heard Vincent had sent for a bride from back east. Congratulations on your marriage." "We're not married yet," Jane corrected quickly. "The preacher comes next week." Val nodded, studying her face. Jane realized too late that her bonnet didn't fully shade the bruise on her cheek from Vincent's backhand. Self-consciously, she turned away. "I should get back to my chores," she said. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Westbrook." "Val, please," he called after her. "And thank you for the water, Miss Beaumont." That night, alone in the cabin, Jane allowed herself to consider possibilities she'd previously dismissed as impossible. The neighboring rancher seemed decent, unlike the handful of rough men she'd encountered in town. Perhaps if things with Vincent became truly unbearable. She shook her head, pushing away the thought. What was she imagining? That a stranger would risk himself to help a woman he'd just met. That she could somehow escape the fate she'd unwittingly chosen for herself. The following day dawned clear and hot. Jane rose early, completing her chores with a strange sense of urgency. With Vincent away, she could almost pretend this was her home, that she was mistress of her own life. But the illusion shattered when, shortly after noon, the sound of horses approached the cabin. Jane's heart sank as she recognized Vincent's figure, returning a day earlier than planned. Something about his posture, the way he dismounted and stalked toward the cabin, sent warning signals through her body. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and stood in the doorway, trying to appear calm. "Vincent," she said, "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot. The smell of whiskey reached her before he did. "Deal fell through," he growled, pushing past her into the cabin. "Damned Anderson claimed my cattle were too scrawny, offered half what we agreed on." His gaze swept the room, settling on the fresh wildflowers Jane had placed on the table. "What's this nonsense?" "Just something to brighten the room," Jane answered, backing away as Vincent knocked the jar of flowers to the floor. "Wasting time on foolishness," he muttered. "Get me food, now." Jane hurried to comply, her hands shaking as she prepared a plate of the stew she'd made earlier. Vincent watched her movements with narrowed eyes, taking long drinks from his whiskey bottle. When she placed the food before him, he grabbed her wrist. "Saw you talking to Westbrook yesterday," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Pete told me." Jane's blood ran cold. "I only offered him water. He was working on the fence line." "Offering more than water, I expect," Vincent snarled, his grip tightening. "Think I don't know what women like you are after? Come out here pretending to want a husband, but really looking for the best deal you can find." "That's not true," Jane protested. "I've done everything you asked, tried to be a good." The blow caught her across the face, harder than before. Jane crashed against the stove, crying out as her arm touched the hot surface. Vincent was on his feet now, advancing toward her. "Lying whore," he spat. "Think I don't know your type? My last wife thought she could do better too, ran off with a traveling salesman. Found her body in a ditch 2 counties over." Terror flooded Jane's veins. This wasn't just an angry man, this was a dangerous one with a past he'd carefully concealed. As Vincent reached for her again, Jane ducked under his arm and bolted for the door. His fingers caught in her hair, yanking her backward with enough force to send her sprawling across the floor. "You're not going anywhere," Vincent growled, standing over her. "Not now, not ever." What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. As Vincent bent to grab her, Jane's hand closed around the iron poker beside the fireplace. She swung it with all her strength, connecting with his shoulder. Vincent howled in pain and rage, momentarily staggering backward. Jane scrambled to her feet, clutching the poker before her like a shield. "Put that down," Vincent ordered, his voice deadly calm despite the pain contorting his features. "Stay away from me," Jane warned, edging toward the door. Vincent lunged forward. Jane swung the poker again, but this time he was ready. He caught her arm mid-swing, twisting until she cried out and dropped her weapon. His other hand closed around her throat, pushing her against the wall. "Nobody leaves me," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Nobody." Jane clawed at his hand, fighting for breath as black spots danced before her eyes. The sound of the door crashing open barely registered until suddenly the pressure on her throat disappeared. She slid to the floor, gasping as Vincent was wrenched backward. "That's enough, Walsh." The voice, steady and commanding, belonged to Valiant Westbrook. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light, one hand holding a revolver pointed at Vincent's chest. "This isn't your business, Westbrook," Vincent snarled. "This is between me and my woman." "When a man beats a woman half to death, it becomes everybody's business," Val replied, his eyes flicking briefly to Jane before returning to Vincent. "Miss Beaumont, can you stand?" Jane nodded, struggling to her feet, her throat burning. "Get your things," Val instructed her, not lowering his weapon. "You're not staying here." "She's not going anywhere," Vincent countered, taking a step forward. "She's my property. I paid good money to bring her out here." "She's a human being," Val said, his voice like steel, "not property. And I've heard enough about how you treat women to know she's not safe here." He gestured with the gun. "Back up, Walsh. Let the lady get her belongings." Jane didn't wait for further invitation. She hurried to the bedroom, throwing her most essential items into her valise, her hands trembling so badly she could barely secure the clasp. When she returned to the main room, Vincent and Val remained locked in a standoff, tension crackling between them. "You'll regret this, Westbrook," Vincent warned. "Both of you." "The only thing I regret is not stepping in sooner," Val replied. "Miss Beaumont, step outside. My horse is waiting." Jane clutched her valise to her chest as she edged past Vincent, feeling his hatred like a physical force. Outside, the brilliant afternoon sunlight seemed surreal after the darkness of the cabin. Val backed out after her, keeping his gun trained on Vincent until they reached his horse. "Can you ride?" Val asked, helping Jane secure her valise to the saddle. "Yes," she answered, her voice raspy from Vincent's assault. "Then up you go," Val instructed, giving her a boost into the saddle before swinging up behind her. "Hold tight." As they rode away, Jane couldn't resist looking back. Vincent stood in the doorway of the cabin, his face contorted with rage. The sight sent a fresh wave of fear through her, but the solid presence of Val behind her, the strong arm around her waist keeping her secure in the saddle, provided a counterweight to her terror. They rode in silence for several minutes, putting distance between themselves and Vincent's property. Finally, Val spoke, his voice gentle. "You're safe now, Miss Beaumont. I promise you that." Jane couldn't hold back her tears any longer. They coursed down her cheeks as relief mingled with shame and uncertainty. "Why did you come?" she managed to ask. "I saw him ride in," Val explained. "The way he was sitting that horse, I knew he was in a dangerous mood, and after seeing your face yesterday," he paused. "I know Walsh's reputation. When his last wife disappeared, there were questions. Nothing could be proved, but folks had their suspicions." Jane shuddered, remembering Vincent's chilling words about his previous wife. He said she ran away and was found dead. Val's arm tightened slightly around her waist. "That's not the story I heard, but it doesn't matter now. What matters is getting you somewhere safe." As they crested a small rise, Jane saw Valley View Ranch spread before them, a sprawling property with a large two-story ranch house, substantial barn, bunkhouse, and corrals containing dozens of fine horses. Green pastures stretched in all directions, watered by a stream that cut through the property. "It's beautiful," Jane whispered. "It's home," Val replied simply, "and you're welcome to stay until you decide what you want to do next." As they approached the main house, a middle-aged woman emerged from the doorway, shading her eyes against the sun. Her face registered concern as she took in the scene, Val returning with a battered woman seated before him on his horse. "Rosa," Val called, dismounting and reaching up to help Jane down. "This is Miss Beaumont. She needs our help." The woman Rosa immediately stepped forward, her kind face creasing with sympathy as she assessed Jane's injuries. "Dios mío," she murmured. "Come inside, Nina, we will take care of you." Jane found herself guided into a cool, spacious house that couldn't have been more different from Vincent's squalid cabin. Rosa, who Jane learned was the Westbrook housekeeper and cook, led her to a comfortable bedroom on the second floor, promising hot water for bathing and clean clothes. "Mr. Val's sister left some dresses when she visited last," Rosa explained, opening a wardrobe. "She is taller than you, but we can make adjustments." Left alone to bathe, Jane caught sight of her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Bruises bloomed on her cheek and throat, her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, and her hair hung in tangled disarray. How had she come to this, a mail-order bride fleeing her intended husband, taking refuge with a stranger? After bathing and changing into a simple blue cotton dress from the wardrobe, Jane felt somewhat restored. She brushed her hair and pinned it up, trying to regain some semblance of dignity before facing her rescuer again. When she descended the stairs, she found Val waiting in a comfortable sitting room, freshly washed and changed himself. He rose as she entered, his eyes taking in her transformation. "Miss Beaumont, you look much better. How are you feeling?" "Grateful," Jane answered honestly, taking the seat he offered. "And embarrassed. I've put you in a difficult position, Mr. Westbrook." "Val," he corrected gently, "and you've done nothing wrong. Vincent Walsh is the one who should be embarrassed and arrested if I had my way." Rosa appeared with a tray bearing coffee and fresh baked biscuits. As Jane accepted a cup with still trembling hands, she found herself telling her story how she'd come to Arizona Territory full of hope, only to discover the man whose letters had won her heart was nothing like the brutal reality. The letters, she concluded, must have been written by someone else, or he deliberately misrepresented himself to lure a wife from the East. Val's expression darkened. It wouldn't be the first time such a thing has happened. Some men view women as commodities to be acquired, not partners to be cherished. What will happen now? Jane asked, voicing her greatest fear. He'll come for me, won't he? Val's jaw tightened. He might try. But my ranch hands are loyal, and Sheriff Morgan in Nogales is a fair man who doesn't tolerate abusive women. If Walsh comes here, he'll regret it. But I have nowhere to go, Jane said softly. No money, no family to return to in Boston. You have options, Val assured her. For now, you're welcome to stay here as my guest. Rosa could use help with household matters. She's been complaining for years that this place needs a woman's touch. He smiled briefly. Once you're recovered, we can discuss your future. There are respectable families in Nogales who would welcome an educated Eastern woman as a governess or companion. The kindness in his voice brought fresh tears to Jane's eyes. Why are you helping me? She asked. You don't know me. Val was quiet for a moment, his eyes serious. My mother came west as a young woman to marry my father, he finally said. She was fortunate he was a good man who loved her deeply, but she often told me stories of other women who weren't so lucky, women trapped in terrible situations with no way out. He leaned forward slightly. I believe we have a responsibility to help those in need when we can. It's as simple as that. In that moment, Jane saw clearly the difference between the man she'd agreed to marry and the one sitting across from her now. Vincent's cruelty stemmed from viewing her as property, a possession to be controlled. Val's kindness came from seeing her as a person deserving of respect and safety. Thank you, she whispered, unable to express the depth of her gratitude. That night, behind a locked door in the clean, comfortable bedroom, Jane slept deeply for the first time since arriving in Arizona Territory. Despite her uncertain future, despite the bruises that still ached, she felt safer than she had in days. The following morning brought a visit from Sheriff James Morgan, a weathered man with a silver mustache and steady eyes. Val had sent a ranch hand to Nogales to report the incident, and the sheriff had ridden out immediately. Miss Beaumont, he greeted her gravely, removing his hat as he entered the Westbrook parlor. I'm sorry for what you've endured. I'll need to ask you some questions about what happened. Jane recounted her experience with Vincent from her arrival to his violent assault. The sheriff took notes, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. This isn't the first complaint against Walsh, he confirmed when she'd finished. There have been incidents, but without witnesses willing to testify, my hands were tied. He looked directly at Jane. Would you be willing to sign a statement about what happened? It would help me bring charges. Yes, Jane answered without hesitation. I'll do whatever is necessary. After the sheriff departed, promising to pay Vincent a visit, Val found Jane on the front porch, gazing out at the mountains in the distance. You did well, he said, joining her at the railing. It takes courage to stand up against someone like Walsh. I don't feel courageous, Jane admitted. I feel foolish for not seeing through his deception, for traveling thousands of miles to marry a man I didn't know. You were seeking a better life, Val replied. There's no shame in that. The shame belongs to the man who took advantage of your trust. Over the following days, Jane gradually regained her strength and spirits. Rosa taught her the rhythms of ranch life, from the early morning breakfast preparations to the evening rituals. Jane threw herself into helping, grateful for the opportunity to earn her keep while she contemplated her next steps. Val's ranch hands, a diverse group of cowboys from various backgrounds, treated her with a mixture of respect and protective courtesy that touched her deeply. They tipped their hats when she brought meals to the bunkhouse, offered shy compliments on her cooking, and made it clear without words that they considered her under their protection. A week after her escape, Sheriff Morgan returned with news. Vincent Walsh had been arrested for assault, but had posted bail and been released. He's making threats, the sheriff warned. claiming Miss Beaumont stole from him, that she's his legal wife under common law because they lived together. None of it holds water legally, but I thought you should know he's not taking this quietly. Val's expression hardened. I've doubled the guards on the property. If he shows his face here, he'll regret it. Just be careful, the sheriff cautioned. Men like Walsh are most dangerous when cornered. That evening, Jane found Val in his study, poring over ranch accounts. He looked up as she entered, his face softening. I wanted to thank you again, Jane said, for everything you've done, but I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely. The sheriff mentioned there might be a position available with the doctor's family. In town, his wife needs help with their children. Val set down his pen. Is that what you want, to work as a governess in town? Jane hesitated. I need to support myself. I can't continue to live here as your charity case. You're not a charity case, Val replied, standing and moving around the desk. You've more than earned your keep with your work alongside Rosa. The house hasn't run this smoothly in years. Even so, Jane insisted, it isn't proper. People will talk. Val studied her face. Would it be proper if you were here in an official capacity? As my housekeeper, perhaps. The offer was generous, but something in Jane rebelled at the thought of becoming an employee in the household where she'd begun to feel at home in a different way. Over the past week, her feelings toward Val had evolved from gratitude into something deeper, more complex. The way he treated his workers with respect, his gentleness with the horses, his quiet strength all had combined to create an impression entirely different from her initial experience with Vincent. Jane began, unsure how to express her conflicted feelings. Before she could continue, the sound of hoofbeats approached the house. Val moved swiftly to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. It's Walsh, he said grimly, reaching for the rifle mounted on the wall. With 2 men I don't recognize, stay here. Val, no, Jane protested, fear clutching at her heart. He's dangerous. Let me speak to him. Absolutely not, Val cut her off, his voice firm. You're not facing that man again. I'll handle this. Jane followed him to the front hall despite his objections. Through the window, she could see Vincent dismounting, flanked by 2 rough-looking men. All 3 were armed. Rosa, Val called, and the housekeeper appeared from the kitchen. Take Miss Beaumont upstairs and stay there. Val, please, Jane begged. Don't risk yourself for me. His eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. Some things are worth the risk, he said softly. Then, to Rosa, go now. From the upstairs window, Jane watched as Val stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. Several of his ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, similarly armed. Vincent's voice carried in the evening air, demanding that Jane be turned over to him. Val's response was too quiet to hear, but his stance was unmistakably protective. The confrontation lasted several tense minutes. At one point, Vincent made a move toward his gun, but something, perhaps the steady aim of Val and his men, made him reconsider. Finally, with a gesture of disgust, Vincent and his companions remounted and rode away, dust rising behind them in the fading light. Jane sagged against the window frame in relief. Rosa patted her shoulder comfortingly. Mr. Val knows how to handle men like that, she assured Jane. He won't let anything happen to you. When Val came upstairs to report what had happened, his face was grim but satisfied. Walsh won't be bothering you again, he said. I made it clear that if he sets foot on my property or approaches you in town, he'll face more than just the law. What did he want? Jane asked, though she could guess the answer. He claims you belong to him, Val answered, anger flashing in his eyes. That he paid for your passage west and you're obligated to honor your agreement. As if I were cattle or a piece of furniture, Jane said bitterly. You're neither, Val replied firmly. You're a free woman who can make her own choices. Later that night, unable to sleep, Jane slipped downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. To her surprise, she found Val seated at the table, a cup of coffee before him, his expression thoughtful. You should be resting, he said, rising as she entered. I couldn't sleep, Jane admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I see him standing there, demanding my return as if I were property. Val's face softened with understanding. It will get easier with time, he promised, and you're safe here. Jane took a seat across from him, gathering her courage. Val, I need to know something. When this is over, when Vincent is no longer a threat, what happens then? To me, I mean, what do you want to happen? Val countered gently. The question hung in the air between them. Jane looked down at her hands, then back up at Val's face, his kind eyes, the strength in his features, the patience with which he awaited her answer. I want to stay, she whispered. Not as your housekeeper or your charity case, but I don't know if that's possible. Val reached across the table, covering her hand with his. When I first saw you in town, he said slowly, something about your face stayed with me. Then when I saw you at Walsh's property with that bruise on your cheek, his jaw tightened. I knew I couldn't stand by and let him hurt you. You risked so much for a stranger, Jane said. You're not a stranger anymore, Jane, Val replied, his voice deepening. These past weeks, watching you recover, seeing your strength and grace despite everything you've endured, I've come to care for you very much. Hope bloomed in Jane's chest, fragile but undeniable. I've come to care for you too, she admitted. But after what happened with Vincent, the deception, the violence, I'm afraid to trust those feelings. Val nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then we'll take it slowly, he promised, day by day. No pressure, no expectations, just two people getting to know each other properly. I would like that, Jane said, a genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in weeks. The following month brought significant changes. With Jane's testimony, Vincent Walsh was indicted for assault and attempted murder. When investigators began looking more closely into the disappearance of his previous wife, Vincent fled the territory, abandoning his failing ranch and escaping justice, at least temporarily. The law will catch up with him eventually, Sheriff Morgan assured Jane. Men like that always make mistakes. With Vincent gone, Jane was free to build a new life. True to his word, Val gave her the time and space she needed to heal. They developed a comfortable routine morning coffee on the porch watching the sunrise, afternoons when Jane would bring refreshments to Val and his men as they worked with the horses, evenings spent in conversation by the fireplace. Slowly, cautiously, their relationship deepened. Val introduced Jane to the operations of the ranch, teaching her to ride properly on a gentle mare he selected especially for her. Jane transformed the neglected kitchen garden into a thriving plot that supplied the house with fresh vegetables and herbs. Together, they visited Nogales, where Val proudly introduced Jane to merchants and townspeople as his friend from the East. 3 months after her arrival at Valley View Ranch, Val took Jane on a picnic to a secluded spot overlooking a small lake on his property. As they sat beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, Jane marveled at how different her life had become from what she'd expected when stepping off the train in Nogales. Penny for your thoughts, Val said, noticing her contemplative expression. I was just thinking about fate, Jane replied. How the worst day of my life led me to you. Val reached for her hand. I've been wanting to ask you something, Jane, something important. Her heart quickened as he took a small box from his pocket. I know we agreed to take things slowly, he continued, and if you need more time, I understand. But I love you, Jane Beaumont. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. I want to build a life with you not as my housekeeper or my guest, but as my wife and partner. He opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. This was my mother's, he explained. She made me promise I would only give it to a woman who was as strong and loving as she was. I found that woman in you. Tears filled Jane's eyes as Val slipped to one knee beside her. Jane Beaumont, will you marry me? Yes, she whispered, joy overwhelming her. Yes, Valiant Westbrook, I will marry you. As he slid the ring onto her finger, Jane felt the last shadows of her ordeal with Vincent Walsh fade away. Here, with this good and honorable man, she had found not just sanctuary but love, real love based on respect, admiration, and shared values. Their wedding, held in the Nogales church the following month, was attended by the entire town. Rosa wept openly as Jane walked down the aisle in a cream-colored silk dress that Val had ordered from Tucson. The ranch hands stood awkwardly in their Sunday best, genuine affection in their weathered faces as they watched their boss marry the woman who had brought new life to Valley View Ranch. As the years passed, Jane and Val built the partnership they had both dreamed of. Under their combined efforts, Valley View Ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Jane established a small school for the children of the ranch workers, teaching reading and mathematics alongside practical skills. Val expanded their herd, breeding some of the finest horses in Arizona. In the spring of 1884, their family grew with the birth of their son, Thomas. 2 years later, a daughter, Elizabeth, joined the family. Jane, who had once feared she would never find happiness in the harsh landscape of the frontier, discovered that with love and respect as its foundation, even the most difficult circumstances could blossom into joy. Sometimes, riding alongside Val across their property, watching their children grow strong and confident in the freedom of ranch life, Jane would remember the frightened young woman who had stepped off the train in Nogales. The mail-order bride who had unwittingly walked into a nightmare, only to find her way to a dream she hadn't known to wish for. "Any regrets?" Val would ask, catching her in these moments of reflection, and Jane would smile, reaching for his hand. "Not one," she would answer truthfully. "Every step of the journey led me home." In 1897, 15 years after Jane had arrived in Arizona Territory, news reached them that Vincent Walsh had been killed in a barroom brawl in New Mexico. The man who had once terrorized Jane was gone, but the life she had built with Val remained strong and vibrant. By then, Valley View Ranch had expanded to include thousands of acres. Their children were growing up, Thomas showing signs of his father's skill with horses, Elizabeth displaying her mother's intelligence and determination. The frontier was changing, becoming less wild as civilization pushed westward, but the values that had guided Jane and Val's partnership remained: constant courage, honesty, and unwavering love. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Val surprised Jane with a trip to San Francisco, her first journey beyond Arizona since her arrival. As they stood on the deck of a passenger ship, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, Val wrapped his arms around his wife's waist. "Happy?" he asked, his voice still strong despite the silver now threading through his hair. Jane leaned back against him, secure in the embrace of the man who had offered her sanctuary when she needed it most and love when she was ready to receive it. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she answered, and turned in his arms to seal the promise of 20 more years with a kiss.